Do you remember having that talk? You know, the one that we always have with our parents? Sometimes it may be at the dinner table, traveling on vacation, or sitting and waiting in the car as you're waiting to go to a sporting event, or maybe even sometimes waiting or on your way to the movies or to the mall to meet up with your friends. It usually happens as we approach puberty. Do you remember having that talk? I remember my talk very vividly. I was 12 years old and had just moved to New York. I had my talk with my father and my late uncle. But it wasn't the talk that you're probably thinking of. No, you see, this talk was very different. Omololu, you're old enough now, and you need to be careful. You need to be careful when you're going out. The people you're going out with, because people are going to look at you differently. The police are going to look at you differently and treat you differently than some of your white friends. You need to make sure that you're always aware of your surroundings, aware of the way you're dressed, how you're talking, the people that you're with. To my black friends, do you remember having this talk? And to my non-black friends, have you ever had such a talk with your parents before? Now, what my dad, my mom, my uncle, and the rest of my family didn't know was I was already beginning to experience all these things that they were talking to me about and warning me about. I was in 7th grade, and I quickly learned that my experiences in international schools was going to be very different here in America. For starters, I went to an all-boy Catholic middle and high school. And oh man, pubescent boys are ruthless, especially if you're the new kid. At this particular point in time, I'd already been teased and joked about my African heritage, about my name, and for speaking with a mild British accent. Most of the time I was able to brush it off, quietly ignoring them and continuing with my own thing. And this was something that was reinforced, and I was told by my teachers to ignore them. Ignore that noise. But everyone has a breaking point. On this particular day, my classmate was at it again. At first I thought something in him had changed, as his comment was about how he said he saw my family on TV, how he saw my dad on TV. So for a moment, I let my guard down and was willing to see where this conversation was going to go. At first I was thinking, oh, okay, this is interesting. I know that my dad has been on TV due to the nature of his job. As I was wondering what he was talking about, I asked, all right, well, what channel was it that you saw my dad and my family on? It was at this point, with this sheepish grin that he had on his face, that he said, I saw your family on the Discovery Channel, walking around naked in and out of your mud huts. He loved it. He loved the attention he was getting. And this was my breaking point. He had really got underneath my skin, and to make matters worse, my classmates who were nearby were laughing. The student, as he was sitting there in his chair, feeling empowered, and with the support from the crowd, he was getting ready for his next delivery. However, he had really got underneath my skin. I flipped my desk and I took a swing at him. He leaned back and fell to the floor, and before I knew it, I was rushed outside of the classroom, having to explain myself in front of my teacher, one-on-one. And when I say conversation, I was actually trembling with frustration, with tears of anger running down my face, having to explain to him my actions. I said, "This is your fault because you're aware, and this isn't the first time that this has been happening, and you haven't done anything about it. It has happened to me before." This was a difficult and quiet time for me in my life as a young, black, African teenage boy in a new country, in a new place, very different from his international experience in different schools. But I made a promise to myself that I was not going to stay silent. I was going to speak up. A lot has happened to me since then, from being racially profiled by the police when I was 13 years old and out at the movies with my white friend, or another experience in high school, driving in a car with a diplomatic license plate with my other black friend, being pulled over essentially for being black, with no credible explanation by the police officer. I've always been the minority, whether it be on a sports team, whether it be singing classes, or to the experience of being the first black president of the student body in a predominantly white high school. And with that, I've felt and I've seen that I've always had the magnifying glass zoomed in on me, indeed watching my every move, because I was representative of every other black person my age. It's a pressure and uncomfortable feeling that I've learned to adjust to and to kind of get comfortable with, actually. I guess what I'm trying to say here is to continue posting, protesting, advocating, and voting for change. Also, let us remember that the underlying change is going to come from cultural change in changing people. But cultural change is the hardest thing to do. It's not impossible, but it's a very difficult and tiring process. Difficult because you would see racial divide, and you see racial divide all around us. For me, whether it be walking into the cafeteria in middle school or in high school and seeing how all the students were grouped by a certain kind of demographic on different tables. Now, this made it very difficult for me because I would float from table to table and have and interact with all tables in the lunchroom. And I'm sure that people who look different from you are open and willing to have these conversations. And it's important to respect and understand where they're coming from as they open up, as they become vulnerable to have these open conversations. Because as Nelson Mandela has said it perfectly, we are not born learning to hate someone based on the color of their skin. And he's right. That's not something that we are born naturally to do. We're not born to hate someone because of their skin color, because of the texture of their hair, their gender, their race or ethnic background, or their religion. People learn to hate, whether it's something that they're taught directly or indirectly. And just as you are taught and learn to hate, it's also possible to be taught to be compassionate, empathetic, and to learn to love. I hope we can have more conversations like this within our families, with our children, and no, not just about drugs and sex, but more talks about race, about racism, about religion, about gender, about inequality, about human rights. That we can have more of these conversations also with our friends, with our colleagues, and that we can learn to get comfortable having these uncomfortable conversations so that we can change the racial narrative and injustices that exist, unfortunately, in our society today in 2020. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay woke, be compassionate, and be resilient.